referendum will be going off. So this would be an increase of obviously $750,000 per year for each of the next 4 years. One question that we get fairly often is what happens to my taxes? If the referendum passes, your taxes will go up by approximately 43 mils, or that's $43 per $100,000 of valuation. If the referendum fails, your taxes will go down by approximately 98 mils, or $98 per $100,000 valuation. So that's the tax implications of what we're talking about. I want to talk about revenue limit really quick. Wisconsin schools operate under something called revenue limits, and sometimes people get state aid and revenue limits confused. Revenue limits come out of a formula that we have to follow through the state, and that tells you how much money you can spend per pupil for your school district. Aids are the amount of money that the state gives you as part of that revenue limit, and then the local taxpayers make up the rest of that revenue limit. We aren't talking right now about state aid at all. We're talking about increasing our revenue limit for the next 4 years. As a school district, we are not a highly aided district. Mike, we're about 10, 12%, 10%? About 10% of what we spend on students in the Spooner area school districts comes through state aid. 90% of it comes from us, locally. Us, businesses, homeowners, through property taxes. But we're talking about increasing that revenue limit, and that's where that is. If the state sets a revenue limit, how come we can't stick to the revenue limit? That's a question I get sometimes. I mean, the state mandates. This year, the state mandated revenue limit was $9,000. The low spending was $9,200. But that doesn't mean that every school district operates under the same revenue limit. School districts throughout the state operate under different revenue limits that were set initially at a level of what they were spending in the 1992-93 school year. During the 92-93 school, after the 92-93 school year, that's when the state government put in revenue limits. And so your revenue limit is based on what you spent back then. Now, there have been annual increases of a percentage of what you spent at that time. If a school district had a high revenue, high per pupil spending in 1992-93, they're probably still a high spending district. If a district was a low spending district in 92-93, they're probably still a low spending district. If a district put on new roofs in 1992-93, that was part of their revenue limit. Hey, that bumped up their per pupil spending, and they've carried that forward for the last 17 or 18 years. Historically, the Spooner Area School District has been a relatively low spending district. There have been quite a few years where we hit the low spending limit. We put a bottom limit on it about 5 or 6 years ago and said you can spend up to here, even if the revenue limit formula said you could spend below that. So that's where we are. We weren't high spending in 1992-93, and we have a history in the school district of not being a high spending school district. Another question I get sometimes is, all right, we built this building here. We passed a referendum about 4 years ago. Actually, passed 2 referendums 4 years ago. One was to build some buildings, and the other was to increase the revenue limit. And you said you got great bids in on the building of the building, and you underspent that. How come you can't just use some of that money to carry you forward? Well, we can't do it because it's illegal. That's pretty good reasoning. When we passed the referendum for building the buildings, the referendum said you'll use this money to build a new high school and remodel and add on to the middle school. And that's all we can use that money for. We cannot use that money for operational purposes. And so what we've done when we got the good bids in and we were able to build the buildings, what we did with the other money was do things that we hoped we would be able to do to defray future expenses. Like we put new roofs on the gymnasiums. The roofs on the gymnasiums were 25 years old, 20 years old, almost 25 years old. The life expectancy on a roof is about 20 years. We were going to have to do that sooner or later. We were lucky that we underspent on the buildings and were able to do that at the middle school. We also did some things at the middle school, like we replaced some of the HVAC controls so that long term we can save on energy consumption there. But we cannot use that money that we underspent for operational purposes, and we can't use it to add on to the elementary school either, for that matter. It has to be used just at the high school and middle school. And that was why we ran two referendums, one for building and one for operational purposes. Let's see. What kind of questions do you have? I get a question, hey, why don't we cut out sports? Save a bunch of money cutting out sports. Well, actually, our budget for sports at the high school is about $250,000. And that comes out of general fund money. So we spend, to run all the sports here, about $250,000. We get in through fees and ticket sales and passes about $40,000. So our net cost on our athletics at the high school level is about $210,000. We have a lot of kids that participate in activities, in sports, athletics, other types of activities, because I'm throwing in other types of activities with that $250,000. A lot of kids come to school to do those things, and a lot of parents like to have their kids involved in those activities. If we had about 65 kids that open enrolled out because we didn't have those activities, we would actually be losing money by cutting out all of our sports. And if you pick an individual sport and said, let's just cut that one, my guess is we could lose money doing that too. So with competition between districts, having the activities can actually save you money. Cutting activities can actually cost you money. Our mill rate, well, you've probably seen some of the information on mill rate. Our mill rate compared to area districts is relatively low. This year we're at 8.42, 8.9 this year for our mill rate. And we are often compared with what's called our CESAs, or Cooperative Educational Services Agency, which encompasses 39 area school districts. So when we compare to school districts in our area, our mill rate is about 35th out of the 39 school districts, so it's relatively low in comparison to a lot of the other area school districts.
Question, if in 1992-93 these revenue limits were set, isn't it pretty antiquated? We're in now 2011. Is anything being done at the state level to change things? And the other part of the question would be, because we're a low spending district, we're being penalized for it?
Well, the question was about is our funding system antiquated because it was started in 92, 93, and is anything being done about it? There's talk at the state level. The Department of Public Instruction has put out what is a new funding formula to fund schools. And we'll go back. But the formula that they are putting out does not address revenue limits at all. So that's